Her brother sold her future like a piece of land. No questions, no hesitation, just a handshake and a signed piece of paper. Tessa Holloway didn't realize she had become a commodity until it was too late. The enemy didn't come from the shadows or from a stranger. He slept under the same roof as her, sat at the same dinner table, called her little sister. And when she looked into his eyes one last time, she saw only one thing. He had no regrets. Please like and subscribe to the channel to follow this story to the end, and comment below with the name of the city you're watching, so I know how far my story has come on this journey. The morning her father died, Tessa Holloway was the one who found him. She had gone to wake him before dawn like she always did. Their routine so old and worn it had grooves in it, like a path through grass walked the same way every day for 20 years. She carried a tin mug of coffee, still steaming. She knocked twice, soft, then pushed the door open, and the smell hit her before her eyes adjusted to the dark. He was in his chair by the window. Not in bed. That was the first wrong thing. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, his hands loose in his lap, his chin dropped toward his chest, and there was a stillness to him that the living don't carry. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. The coffee was still hot in her hand. She didn't go in. She didn't call for Caleb. She just stood there. And the silence pressed against her ears, and slowly the sun came up through the dirty window glass and laid a strip of gold across the floor between them. That was how the worst year of her life began. With a mug of coffee she never set down, and a man who wouldn't wake up, and outside the wind moving through the valley like it didn't know anything had changed. His name had been Amos Holloway. He'd come to the Cimarron Valley 23 years ago with a pregnant wife, a borrowed horse, and enough stubbornness to qualify as a sixth sense. He'd built the homestead with his own hands. Not well, not fast, but thoroughly, in the way that men who expect to stay somewhere build things. He'd outlasted 2 brutal winters, a drought that dried the creek to a trickle, a prairie fire that took the eastern fence line, and a neighbor dispute that ran for 4 years before the other man gave up and moved his family to Oklahoma. He was not an easy man to love. He was short-tempered in particular, and he never once said the words, "I'm proud of you," not to Tessa, not to anyone. But he had kept the land. Through everything, he had kept the land. Now it was just the land and his children, and only one of them had ever understood what it cost him. The homestead sat at the northern edge of a wide, flat-bottom valley where the creek made a bend. 320 acres, more or less, with a 2-room house that needed a new roof, a barn that leaned west in heavy wind, a small orchard of apple trees her mother had planted before she died, and a kitchen garden Tessa had expanded every spring since she was 12. It wasn't much by some measures. By others, it was everything. Caleb Holloway was 28 years old and had never in his life woken before sunrise by choice. When Tessa finally went to get him that morning, she had to shake him twice before his eyes opened, and the first thing he said was not what happened or is he gone. The first thing he said was, "How bad is it?" She didn't answer that. There wasn't a way to answer it that made sense. Caleb handled the death the way he handled most things, in pieces, taking care of whatever was directly in front of him and not thinking past it. He rode to town to get the undertaker. He took care of the papers. He stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and his eyes dry and his jaw set, and afterward he shook hands with the neighbors who came and accepted their casseroles and their condolences with the kind of mechanical courtesy that gets a person through public grief when private grief hasn't fully landed yet. For a while, Tessa thought they might be all right. She worked. That was what she knew how to do. She was up before light and in bed after dark, and in the hours between she did the work of 2 people without complaint. Not because she was a saint, but because the alternative was lying in the dark, thinking about things she couldn't fix, and that was worse. She mended the fence along the creek. She replanted the kitchen garden. She mucked the barn, kept the chickens, managed the 2 cows they had left after her father sold one the previous autumn. She kept the accounts in a small brown ledger with a stub of pencil, the way her father had taught her. And when she ran the numbers at the end of the month, she sat with them for a long time without blinking. The numbers were not good. They had not been good for longer than her father had let on. There was the mortgage payment, which was 3 months behind. There was the equipment note at the hardware, which her father had taken out in February and never mentioned. There was seed they still owed on, and the cost of the undertaker, and a small debt to a man named Prater who'd lent Amos Holloway $20 the previous fall on a handshake and a promise. Tessa laid it all out on the table in the lamplight and stared at it and thought about how her father had carried all of this by himself without saying a word to her. and she felt something complicated move through her that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger and settled somewhere in between. When she brought it to Caleb, he looked at the numbers for about 40 seconds. "We'll figure it out," he said. "That's not a plan, Caleb. That's a sentence. Don't start." "Someone has to start. We're behind on the mortgage. If we don't make a payment by the end of next month, the bank can begin proceedings. You understand what that means." Caleb pushed back from the table. "I'm aware of what proceedings means." "Then tell me what you intend to do about it." He didn't answer. He got up and went outside, and she heard his boots on the porch boards, and then the creak of the step, and then nothing. She sat at the table with the ledger in front of her and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed. That was in April. By the end of May, she'd begun to understand the shape of the problem. Caleb talked a great deal about plans and very little about work. He rode into Harlow Creek 2 or 3 times a week. The nearest town, a settlement of maybe 400 people built around a freight depot and a handful of storefronts, and came back with nothing to show for it except vague mentions of conversations he'd had, men he'd spoken to, possibilities that were just beginning to come together. He was charming the way their father had never been, quick with a smile and a story, and people liked him well enough in the abstract, the way people like someone they don't have to live with. But charm doesn't fix fence posts, and it doesn't pay the bank. In June, Tessa rode into Harlow Creek herself. She went to the bank first, hat in hand, literally, because she didn't own a hat and had to borrow her father's, which was too big, and spoke to the bank manager, a thin man named Hargrove, who had the sort of face that had decided long ago not to waste energy on expressions. She told him honestly where they stood. She asked about an extension on the mortgage payments, something modest, 2 months, to give them time to bring in what they could from the summer harvest and the apple crop in September. Hargrove listened with his hands folded on the desk and then told her, politely but without a single unnecessary word, that the bank had already been in contact with her brother regarding the matter. "In contact how?" she asked. Hargrove looked at her in a way that said he wasn't entirely sure he should be the one telling her this. "Your brother came in last week," he said carefully. "He spoke with us about the property's situation. I understood he was representing the household." Tessa kept her face even. "I see. And what did you discuss?" "I think," Hargrove said, "you might want to speak with your brother." She rode home in the afternoon heat with her father's hat pulled low and a feeling like a stone behind her sternum. She didn't ask Caleb about it that night because she knew herself well enough to know that if she started asking questions before she had more information, the conversation would go sideways before she got to anything useful. So she waited. She watched. What she noticed, Caleb stopped talking about the debts. He stopped looking worried in the way he had in April, the subtle, distracted worry of a man facing a math problem he doesn't have the numbers for. He started sleeping in later. He started coming home from town with a better quality of mood than the circumstances warranted. Once she noticed he'd gotten a haircut she hadn't known about and paid for it somehow. In the 3rd week of June, a man rode up to the homestead on a horse that cost more than everything Tessa owned. His name was Edmund Rourke. She was in the yard when he arrived, raking out the kitchen garden. She didn't know who he was yet, only that the horse was a dark bay with a white blaze and it cost at least $300, and that the man riding it wore a coat that hadn't been bought in Harlow Creek. He was somewhere in his 50s, she guessed, compact, broad through the shoulders, with gray threading through dark hair at his temples, and a quality of stillness that didn't read as calm so much as the absence of the need to perform. He looked at things as though he was adding them up. He looked at her like that, too. "Miss Holloway?" he said. Not a question. "That's right," she said. She kept the rake in her hands. "Edmund Rourke. He didn't get off the horse. I have some business with your brother. He mentioned you'd be here." "He didn't mention you to me." Something shifted in his face. Not discomfort exactly, but a recalibration. "I expect we'll have a chance to speak properly," he said. "I look forward to it." Caleb came out of the house then, moving too fast, his smile arriving ahead of him like something he'd sent on ahead to smooth the road. He shook Rourke's hand with the grip of a man trying to make a good impression and said something Tessa couldn't catch over the wind. The two of them went inside. She stood in the garden with the rake in her hands for a long time after the door closed. She didn't go in. She told herself it was because she had work to finish, and that was partly true. But mostly she didn't go in because she had learned, early and in small, uncomfortable ways, that what Caleb didn't want her to hear was usually more important than what he said to her directly. She wanted to know what he was doing before he got the chance to frame it. That night she asked him who Rourke was. "A businessman," Caleb said. "He has holdings up and down the valley." "Holdings as in?" "Land, mostly, cattle, some other things." He was eating at the table, not looking at her. "He's interested in making an investment in this property." "What kind of investment?" "The financial kind, Tessa. The kind that keeps us from losing everything." She set her fork down slowly. "Explain what that means." Caleb chewed, swallowed, reached for his water. He had their father's jawline, squared, stubborn, and nothing else of him that she could see. "He's willing to clear the mortgage debt and the other notes," he said. "All of it. In exchange for a share of the property going forward." "A share?" "A partnership of sorts." "And what does he want in return for that kind of generosity?" Caleb finally looked at her. There was something behind his eyes she didn't like. Not shame, because she knew his face well enough to recognize shame, and this wasn't it. It was calculation. The look of someone who has thought a situation through and decided that the thing they're about to say is survivable, as long as they say it right. "He's a widower," Caleb said. "He's been looking to settle his affairs and build something lasting. The land is part of it." "And?" "He'd like to marry." The room was quiet. Outside, a nightbird called once and then stopped. "Say it plainly," Tessa said. Caleb set his fork down. "He wants to marry you, Tessa. He's willing to pay off every debt we have, clear the mortgage, and put money in our hands besides, in exchange for the marriage. It's a good arrangement, better than good." She stared at him. She waited for him to say something that changed what she had just heard. He didn't. "You told him yes," she said. "You already told him yes." "I told him we'd discuss it." "When?" "Last week." "Last week?" Before she'd gone to the bank. Before Hargrove had looked at her with that careful, hedging expression. While she was out mending fence or hauling water or doing the 1,000 small things that kept the homestead from coming apart at the seams, her brother had ridden into town and made arrangements for her life without her. "I'm not a piece of property," she said. "No one said you were. You just sold me like I was. Don't be dramatic." She stood up. She didn't slam anything, didn't raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that losing her temper with Caleb gave him something to point to, a way to make the argument about her behavior instead of his. "Don't finish that sentence," she said quietly. "Think very hard about whether you want to finish that sentence." He didn't. She went to bed. She didn't sleep. Edmund Rourke came back 3 days later, this time with one of his men. He had a quality of moving through spaces as though he already owned them, a way of looking at rooms and people and land like he was itemizing them. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the valley, about the growth he expected over the next decade, about the opportunities for a well-positioned property. He was not unpleasant. He was articulate and informed, and he had the kind of self-possession that comes from decades of getting what he wanted. He directed most of his conversation at Caleb, with occasional deliberate glances at Tessa that were designed to include her, but not actually include her, the way you might gesture toward a door you don't expect anyone to open. She watched him. She listened to every word. When he was done, when the coffee was finished and Caleb had walked him to the door with a handshake and a number of affirmatives, she sat at the table and thought about what she had heard. She was 22 years old. She had grown up in this valley, on this land. She had worked it alongside her father since she was old enough to be useful, and before that she had tagged along behind him learning the things she was too young to do herself. She knew every fence post on the property, every weak spot in the creek bank, every apple tree by its position and its temperament and its typical yield. She knew what the soil was like on the South Ridge, which was different from the bottomland near the creek, and she knew where the good grass grew in summer and where it went thin. Her father had never said he was proud of her, but he had taught her everything, and she understood now that those were the same thing in a different language. She was not going to be sold. The question was what she was going to do about it. The difficulty was that Caleb had not technically done anything illegal. Not yet, as far as she could determine. He'd made an agreement on behalf of the household, but he had made it with a man who understood that a woman had to consent to a marriage, which meant the arrangement wasn't binding until she agreed. Rourke was too careful for that kind of miscalculation. Whatever Caleb had promised, he'd promised it as a negotiation, an understood intent, not a signed contract. Not yet. But she had heard Rourke mention in passing a meeting scheduled for the end of the month, something about formalizing the arrangement, and she had seen Caleb nod. She had perhaps 3 weeks. Quote, the town of Harlow Creek was not a complicated place, but it had layers, the way small places always do when you live inside them, long enough to stop seeing the surface. There was the version of the town that visitors saw. The depot, the general store, 2 saloons, a livery, the hotel with its cracked front steps, the row of houses along the main street where the more established families lived. And then there was the version that residents understood. Who owed money to whom? Which men the sheriff actually listened to? Whose reputation was built on substance, and whose was built on performance, and where the real decisions about the valley's future got made. Edmund Rourke had been operating in this valley for 4 years. He'd come from somewhere east, she'd heard Kansas mentioned, also Missouri, with enough capital to start buying land before anyone understood what he was doing. He bought distressed properties, primarily, which in the Cimarron Valley meant properties whose owners were having a bad year or two and had made the mistake of looking for outside help. He'd absorbed 6 parcels in 4 years. The Holloway homestead would be the 7th. What she couldn't yet determine was whether any of what he'd done was illegal or simply ruthless. Those were different things. She needed to know which one she was dealing with. She started going into town more often. She was careful about it, careful not to seem desperate, not to seem like she was searching for something, because in a small town people noticed that kind of thing, and it had a way of getting back to the wrong ears. She had a list of errands she spread out over several trips, so each individual visit had a plausible reason. She bought thread at the general store and stayed to talk for a while. She stopped at the freight office to ask about supply prices. She visited the tiny county clerk's office, which was one room in the back of the building where the sheriff kept his desk, and spent an hour looking at land records on the pretense of confirming her father's survey boundaries. What she found in the land records wasn't nothing, but it wasn't yet enough. She found that 3 of the 6 properties Rourke had acquired showed recorded transactions in the months before their original owners sold or defaulted. Small legal actions, liens, judgments for debts that seemed to come from nowhere, and land in the records without much prior history. She couldn't tell yet whether those were real debts or manufactured ones. She didn't have the knowledge to be certain. But the pattern was there, quiet and consistent, and she wrote everything down in the back of the brown ledger, small and neat, on the pages after the accounts. She also heard things. Not gossip exactly. She wasn't the type to encourage gossip, and people knew that about her. But conversation, the kind that happens around her without being directed at her because she was quiet and steady and easy to forget, was in the room. She heard that Rourke's man, the one who'd come with him to the homestead, was named Doyle and had previously worked for a land speculation company in Kansas that had gone under murky circumstances. She heard that the county judge, whose name was Aldous Crane, had had dinner at Rourke's house twice in the past year. She heard that Caleb Holloway had been seen in one of the saloons spending more freely than a man with his debts should reasonably be spending. She went home and added to her ledger. The conversation she had with Caleb in the 3rd week of June was the worst one of her life, and she'd had a number of bad ones. She'd waited until after supper, when the evening was cooling and there was nowhere to be. She laid the ledger on the table and told him what she'd found. She told him about the land records, the other properties, the pattern she saw. She told him she thought Rourke was building something methodical in this valley, and the Holloway land was the next piece, and Caleb was handing it to him without understanding what he was giving away. Caleb listened to all of it. He let her finish. He had his arms folded across his chest, and his expression had that familiar flatness that meant he'd already decided something before the conversation started, and the conversation itself was just something to get through. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I'm telling you what I found." "You went through the county records." "Yes." "Tessa." He unfolded his arms and put his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly, and his voice shifted into something that was trying to be reasonable and patient, but had a thread of something harder underneath it. "This land is going to be gone by winter if we don't do something. You understand that? Gone. The bank will take it. We'll have nothing. Rourke is offering us a way out." "He's offering you a way out." "He's offering us— He wants me to marry him, Caleb. That's not the same thing as offering us anything. That's using our debt to buy a wife. People have gotten married for worse reasons." She stared at him. "Have you heard yourself?" "I'm being realistic. That's what one of us has to be. I'm not marrying him. You'll change your mind when you understand what the alternative looks like. She stood up. You signed something, didn't you? She said. Not just an agreement. You signed something. His jaw tightened. That was answer enough. What did you sign, Caleb? A letter of intent. It's not legally binding until what? Until the formal arrangement is executed, which requires your... He stopped. My consent, she said, which you don't have, which you will not get. He looked at her then with something she had never seen in his face before, not directed at her, something that was tired and ugly and almost sorry, but not sorry enough to matter. You can be angry at me, he said. That's fine. But you better think hard about what you're going to do when the bank forecloses and we're standing in a field with nothing. She picked up the ledger from the table. She walked to her room and shut the door behind her. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, not crying because she was past the kind of shock that produces tears. She was in the cleaner, colder place past that, where things become clear because you've run out of alternatives and only the truth is left. She turned the ledger over in her hands. She needed a lawyer, and she probably couldn't afford one. She needed someone who understood the county land records well enough to confirm what she suspected. She needed time, which she didn't have much of. And she needed, at some point, a way to stand in front of Edmund Rourke without Caleb in the room and without the assumption that she had been handed to him already. What she had right now was a brown ledger, a set of incomplete records, and the near certain knowledge that her brother had already sold her. It wasn't nothing. She'd built from less.
Atau si stakoti amat.
3 days later, riding back from town along the creek road, she saw the fire. Not her fire. A campfire. Upstream, beyond the old cottonwood stand where the creek bent north before straightening again. She smelled it before she saw it, the particular smell of cottonwood burning clean, and she slowed her horse without quite deciding to and looked through the trees. A single man. A horse picketed nearby, and a fire that was built the way people build them when they know what they're doing. Low, contained, not wasting fuel. He was sitting with his back to her, and she could see only the width of his shoulders and the way he held himself, which was neither relaxed nor tense, but something in between, like a man who'd made peace with the idea that trouble could arrive at any time and had stopped being surprised by it. She didn't speak to him. She wasn't sure why she paused at all. She told herself she was making sure no one was burning too close to the grass. She told herself she was just looking. She rode on after a moment and he didn't move, and she wasn't certain he'd heard her. She didn't know yet who he was. She didn't know what he was doing in the valley or how long he'd been there. She didn't know what the next weeks were going to cost her or how much of what she was planning had any chance of working. She rode home in the late afternoon with the sun behind her throwing her shadow long across the road, and she thought about the ledger in her saddlebag, and she thought about Edmund Rourke's eyes moving across the kitchen like he was pricing the furniture, and she thought about her father's hands, how callous they'd always been, how he'd carried them with a kind of unself-conscious pride, the way working men do. She was his daughter. She'd been shaped by the same land, the same work, the same years of holding on. She had 3 weeks, maybe less, and she was not going to let any of it go without a fight that cost somebody something. She found out his name the way you find out most things in a valley this size, not by asking directly, but by being in the right place when someone else said it out loud. It was at the general store 2 days after she'd seen the fire by the creek. She'd come in for salt and a tin of lamp oil, and Bert Cassell, who ran the store and considered it his civic duty to have an opinion on everything that moved through Harlow Creek, was already talking when she pushed through the door. He was talking to old Pete Dunnigan, who'd run sheep on the West Ridge for 30 years, and had the disposition of a man who had spent too much time alone with animals and not enough with people. Rhett Blackthorne, Bert was saying, and his voice had that particular quality people use when they want to seem like they're only passing information along but are actually enjoying themselves. Came through the depot 2 nights ago. Harlan at the livery confirmed it. Pete made a sound that wasn't quite a word. You know the name? Bert said. Everybody knows the name, Pete said. Doesn't mean I want him camped 10 miles from my flock. Tessa set her basket on the counter and began moving through the shelves. She didn't ask. She listened. The name Rhett Blackthorne carried a specific weight in the territories, the kind of weight that accumulates over years of stories passed between travelers, some true and some expanded in the telling. until the man at the center of them bears only a passing resemblance to whatever he actually is. She had heard the name twice before, once from her father, and once from a ranch hand who'd passed through looking for work 2 summers ago. What she knew, he was a cowboy in the oldest sense of the word, meaning he'd driven cattle, broken horses, and done most of the violent and unglamorous work that kept the frontier economy moving. He had also, at various points, done things that put him on the wrong side of the law in at least 2 territories, though the specifics were murky and she'd never heard the same version of them twice. What everyone agreed on was that he was not a man who inspired indifference. People either wanted him gone or wanted him working for them, and sometimes both at once. She paid for her salt and her lamp oil and rode home without stopping to ask anything else. That night she sat with the ledger and her notes and tried to think clearly about what she had and what she didn't have. The meeting Rourke had mentioned, so the one to formalize the arrangement, was now roughly 2 weeks away. She had found the pattern in the land records, but pattern wasn't proof, and proof was what she needed before she could do anything with it. She needed to find the original owners of those 3 properties, or find someone who had been close enough to those transactions to know whether the liens and judgments Rourke had used were legitimate. She needed, in short, information she didn't yet have access to. She was still sitting with that problem when she finally went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't slept well in weeks. She saw Rhett Blackthorne for the first time 2 days later, and not under circumstances she'd have chosen. She had ridden out to the south fence to check the posts near where the creek ran close to the property line, because one of them had been leaning after the last rain, and she'd been meaning to reset it for a week. She was working the post free of the mud with a digging bar when she became aware that she wasn't alone, and looked up to find a man on horseback at the edge of the cottonwoods, watching her. He was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said clearly what she had expected. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that comes from a life spent outdoors rather than from any deliberate effort, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had enough weather in it to read older than his years at first glance. He had a rifle in a saddle scabbard and a revolver on his hip, and the kind of posture that wasn't relaxed so much as it was permanently calibrated, like he'd spent enough years in situations that required fast decisions that his body had stopped wasting energy on anything that wasn't necessary. He looked at her with gray eyes that were taking in more than just her. "You're on Holloway land," she said. "Creek crossing's about 50 yards back," he said. "I was aiming for it." "You overshot." Apparently. He didn't move. He was looking at the fence post, then at the digging bar in her hands, then back at her. "You want a hand with that?" "No." He nodded once, like that was a reasonable answer, and didn't move. She went back to the post. She was aware of him sitting there on his horse at the edge of her vision, and she was annoyed by it, both the awareness and the annoyance, because she didn't have room in her current situation for either. "You're still here," she said, without looking up. "Just resting the horse." "Rest him somewhere else." She heard him shift in the saddle. Then, unexpectedly, "You're the one Rourke's looking to marry." She stopped. She stood up straight and looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" "Town," he said simply. "It's a small place." "It is," she said. "And what's it to you?" He looked at her steadily. "Nothing yet," he said. "Just a thing I heard." She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away, but he also didn't have the quality of trying to win anything by not looking away. It was just the way he looked at things, direct and without embellishment. She went back to the fence post. "Rhett Blackthorne," she said to the post. "That's right. You have a reputation. Most people do, if they've been around long enough. Yours is particular." "I know what mine is," he said. His voice was even, not defensive. "You can think whatever you like about it." She worked the post free and reset it, packing the mud back with her boot heel and the flat of the bar. It took another 5 minutes, and he was still there when she finished. She straightened up and looked at him again. "You're camping by the creek," she said. "For now." "Why here? Of all the valleys?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression he was deciding how much of an honest answer to give her. "I knew a man who had property here," he said finally. "One of Rourke's acquisitions, fellow named Garner. Lost his place about 2 years ago under circumstances that didn't sit right with me." She kept her face even. "Garner," she said. "South of the creek?" "That's the one. You knew him?" "I knew of him. He'd been here a long time." She looked at the tree line, thinking. What do you mean, didn't sit right? Blackthorn got down from his horse. He didn't do it in a way that was threatening. He moved with care, tying the horse to a branch, giving her time to see what he was doing before he closed any distance between them. He stopped about 10 feet away and pulled his hat off and held it in one hand. Up close, he looked tired in a chronic, deep-rooted way, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. Garner had a debt claimed against him, he said. A promissory note from a man I'd never heard of, for an amount Garner swore he'd never borrowed. By the time he understood what was happening, the judgment had gone through and Rourke had bought the note. Garner lost the property in 6 weeks. Tessa looked at him. A forged note, she said. Garner thought so, couldn't prove it, didn't have the money or the connections to fight it, and the judge who signed off wasn't the type to look too hard at paperwork that came with Rourke's name attached. She thought about the 3 entries she'd found in the land records, the liens and judgments that appeared without prior history. She thought about the pattern she'd been looking at for 2 weeks. How many others? She said. He looked at her with a slight shift of expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected about her. That you can tie to him directly? I don't know. I've been trying to find out. So have I, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, How far have you gotten? She almost told him. She caught herself because she didn't know this man, and knowing a man's reputation wasn't knowing him, and there was no reason to hand her incomplete work to a stranger, dangerous or otherwise. Far enough to know I'm not imagining things, she said. Not far enough to do anything with yet. He nodded. He put his hat back on. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, which was such an unlikely thing for a man with his history to say that it almost made her want to laugh, and she couldn't quite tell whether he was aware of the irony or not. I came because I thought there might be something to find here. Looks like I was right. What do you want out of it? She asked. You're not a lawyer. You're not a lawman. So what do you want? He was quiet for a beat. Garner was a decent man, he said. He's living with his daughter's family in New Mexico now because he lost everything he built. I've seen what Rourke does to people, and I'm tired of seeing it. He paused. That's the honest version. She looked at him. His face was not easy to read, not the closed-off kind of face that's hiding something, but the kind that has learned to move through the world without broadcasting. She thought about Caleb's face, which gave everything away if you knew how to watch it, and she thought about Rourke's face, which gave nothing away because it had been trained to give nothing. And she thought about her father's face, which had been somewhere in between, private but not dishonest. Blackthorn's face was something else, private in a different way, like a man who'd simply been alone with himself for long enough that he'd stopped keeping score of what he showed. All right, she said, and picked up the digging bar. I have to get back. Miss Holloway. She paused. Whatever your brother signed, he said carefully, it may not be as binding as Rourke's letting on. Men like him use paperwork the way other men use guns. It's worth looking at what exactly was put down. She turned back to look at him. What do you know about what he signed? I know Rourke uses a standard form for his letters of intent. I've seen one before. The language is written to sound more binding than it legally is, especially when the person signing doesn't have a lawyer read it first. He met her eyes. Your brother probably doesn't know that. She held that for a moment. Then she nodded, once. I'll think about what you said. She rode back toward the house and didn't look back, but she was thinking hard by the time she cleared the cottonwoods. Word that Rhett Blackthorn was in the valley moved through Harlow Creek with the speed that bad news always moves through small places. By the following morning, it had reached the saloons, and by afternoon, it had reached the more respectable households. And by evening, it had apparently reached Edmund Rourke, because Caleb came home with a look on his face that was trying to be casual and failing. He mentioned it at supper. Casually, like it was nothing. Heard there's a hired gun camped out near the creek, he said. He's not camped on our land, Tessa said. Caleb looked at her. You've seen him. I ran across him checking the south fence. He was crossing to the creek road. Rourke says he's dangerous, says he's been trouble wherever he's gone. Rourke says a lot of things. Caleb put his fork down. You're not to talk to him, you understand me? Whatever he told you. He didn't tell me much, she said, which was mostly true. And you don't tell me who I can talk to, Caleb. I'm serious about this. So am I, she said. So I suggest we both eat our supper and stop having this conversation. He stared at her. She met it, and he looked away first. After supper, she went to the porch and stood in the dark and listened to the valley settle into night. The creek road was invisible from here, but she could hear the water if she was quiet enough, a low, constant sound just at the edge of what the ear could catch. Somewhere out there, beyond the cottonwoods, a fire was probably burning low. She went inside and lit the lamp and opened the ledger to the back pages where her notes were. She wrote down what Blackthorn had told her about the letter of intent. She wrote down Garner's name and added it to the other names she'd collected. She looked at the pattern, all of it laid out in her careful, small handwriting, and she thought about Rourke's man Doyle, and the judge who didn't look too hard at paperwork, and the meeting in 2 weeks that was meant to make everything official. The thing about a pattern is that it only becomes evidence when you can connect the points with something real. She had the points. She needed the connections. She needed someone who had been inside one of those transactions, close enough to testify to what had actually happened. Garner was in New Mexico. The others were scattered or gone. But their paperwork wasn't gone. If Rourke had used forged documents more than once, and if the forgeries were good enough to hold up in front of a county judge, but not good enough to hold up under careful examination by someone who knew what to look for, then the records themselves might tell the story. She needed someone who understood documents better than she did. She needed access to the originals, not the recorded copies. And she needed to do all of it in less than 2 weeks without Caleb finding out, and without Rourke knowing she was looking. She sat with that problem for a long time, with the lamp burning low and the ledger open in front of her and the valley quiet outside. 2 weeks was not much time, but she had been making something from nothing her whole life, and she was not ready to stop. The document she needed was not in the county clerk's office. She'd spent the better part of 3 days working up to that conclusion, going back through the recorded copies, cross-referencing dates, checking the handwriting on the filed instruments against each other, the way her father had once shown her to check fence wire for hidden breaks. Running your hand along it slow, feeling for the place where something wasn't right. The recorded copies were clean. Too clean, in some ways. The kind of clean that comes from someone who has done a thing before and knows which surfaces to wipe. What she needed was the original promissory note that had been used against Garner, not the recorded judgment, the instrument itself, the piece of paper that claimed Garner owed money to a man named Elias Pryor, who, as far as Tessa had been able to determine, did not exist in any other document in Cimarron County before or after that single transaction. Blackthorn had the same suspicion. She knew because she had gone back to the creek road 3 days after their first meeting, not to find him exactly, but not to find him either. And he'd been there, his horse picketed in the same spot, a tin cup in his hand and a piece of paper on his knee that he turned face down when he heard her coming before he registered who she was. Pryor, she said without preamble, the man whose note Garner supposedly owed on. You looked for him. Blackthorn looked at her for a moment. Then he turned the paper back over. Can't find him anywhere. No land records, no tax records, no hotel registry in town going back 4 years. He paused. Rourke's man Doyle has a cousin in Kansas City who used to work in a records office. That's as far as I've gotten. They saw it. I think the original note is still in existence, Tessa said. Somewhere in Rourke's possession. Men like him keep things. They keep things because they think they're untouchable, and because the documents themselves are leverage. Probably right, he said. Getting to them is the problem. I know someone who might have seen them, she said. This was the part she'd been thinking about for 2 days, turning it over, checking it from different angles. Rourke has a housekeeper, woman named Clara Dodd. She's been working his property for about 2 years. Her brother-in-law runs the freight depot. Blackthorn was quiet, listening. I'm not asking her to steal anything, Tessa said quickly, because she needed to be clear about that, to herself as much as to him. I'm asking her if she's seen anything, whether there's a lockbox, a strong box where he keeps papers, that's all. And if Rourke finds out she talked to you? Tessa looked at him steadily. That's why I need to be careful about how I approach her. She paused. I also need to know about the letter of intent my brother signed. You said you'd seen Rourke's standard form before. If I can get you a look at what Caleb actually signed, how would you get a copy? Caleb keeps papers in the bottom drawer of the desk in the front room. He locks it, but I know where the key is because I'm the one who found it when he lost it 3 months ago, and I put it back in a place he doesn't know I know about. Blackthorn looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize. The slight adjustment, the recalibration. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I've been thinking about nothing else," she said. He was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned slow circles over the east ridge, riding a thermal, unhurried. "All right," he said, "get me the letter, and talk to Clara Dodd careful. Don't go to Rourke's property." "I wasn't going to." "And Miss Holloway," she paused. "The meeting Rourke scheduled, it's in 10 days. She knew. She nodded and went back to her horse. Clara Dodd was a practical woman in her late 40s who had survived 2 husbands and a flash flood and had the quality, common to people who've been through enough, of not wasting words on things that didn't matter. Tessa found her at the freight depot on a Thursday morning, helping her brother-in-law sort a delivery. She waited until the brother-in-law moved to the back, then came alongside Clara and kept her voice low and her words plain. She didn't ask Clara to do anything. She told her what she suspected was happening to properties in the valley, including hers. She told her that if she was right, Rourke had been using fraudulent documents to force people off their land for years. She said that if Clara had ever seen anything in that house that didn't sit right with her, Tessa would be grateful to know it, and what Clara told her would go nowhere, except where it needed to go to stop the next person from losing everything. Clara listened with her hand still on the freight manifest she'd been holding. She didn't look at Tessa. She looked at the manifest. Then she said quietly, "He has a strong box in the study. I've seen him open it. Don't know what's in it." "Does he keep the study locked?" "Most times. Not always." She paused. "Doyle's been in there with him twice this week. They closed the door." Tessa thanked her and left. She copied the letter of intent from Caleb's drawer that night, sitting at the kitchen table in lamplight, her brother asleep in the next room, her handwriting as fast and accurate as she could make it. It took 20 minutes. She put the original back exactly as she'd found it, relocked the drawer, put the key back, and went to bed with the copy folded inside the ledger. She brought it to Blackthorne the next morning. He read it without hurry, which was either because he was a careful reader or because he'd learned not to let urgency push him into missing things, or both. She sat on a rock by the creek and watched the water and didn't speak. After a while, he folded it. "The language in paragraph 3, he said. It says, subject to mutual execution of formal agreement. Your brother signed a letter of intent, not a contract. It is not legally binding without a subsequent signed agreement. That subsequent agreement would require your signature as a party to the marriage." "He can't force it," she said. "Not legally." "No." He paused. "But Rourke doesn't always operate through legal channels. If he arrives for that meeting with enough men and the county judge already in his pocket, legal may not be the primary concern." She looked at the water. "So I need something before the meeting, something that shifts the ground. You need to make the irregularities in those land transactions public before he can execute anything. Make it a known thing. Make it hard to bury." He turned the folded letter in his hands. "The problem is that a young woman making accusations against a man of his standing without something concrete to show will be handled as hysteria or personal grievance." She knew that. She'd known it from the beginning, which is why I need the original documents. Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment. "I can get into Rourke's property," he said, "at night. I'm not suggesting you come." "I'm not asking you to go either," she said, fast and clear. "Breaking into a man's house. I've done worse," he said, and his voice was flat, not proud, just factual, and she believed him. "But I'm not suggesting a theft. I'm suggesting a look. If I can confirm the documents exist, know what they contain, we have something to take to someone. Even a territorial judge, if it comes to that." She thought about it. She thought about the 10 days she had left in the meeting at the end of them, and what happened to Clara Dodd's position if Rourke found out she'd talked to anyone. She thought about how far the pattern in her ledger would get her in a room with Edmund Rourke and a county judge who had eaten dinner at his house twice. "Don't take anything," she said. "I won't." "And if you get caught, then I get caught," he said. "That's not your problem." She looked at him. "It would be," she said, and she didn't explain it further, and he didn't ask her to. He went on the 9th night. She didn't know he'd gone until he appeared at the south fence the following morning, earlier than usual, and the way he moved told her something had happened before he said a word. "He has them," Blackthorne said. "The Garner note, and at least 2 others. I couldn't read them in full, but I saw enough. The handwriting on the prior signature matches the handwriting on another document in the same box, a different name, same hand. He paused. There's also a letter from Judge Crane, dated 8 months ago. I didn't get a full read on it, but the first paragraph thanks Rourke for what he terms his generosity and references a matter being resolved satisfactorily. Tessa absorbed this. You saw all of that? Enough of it. But we can't produce the documents themselves. No. He looked tired. He'd clearly been up all night. But you can produce a witness who has seen them and can describe their location. That's enough to get a territorial marshal interested, if we can get to one. The nearest territorial marshal's office was in Clearfield, a day and a half's ride east. The meeting with Rourke was in 6 days. She did the arithmetic in her head. There wasn't enough time to ride to Clearfield, make a report, and get a marshal back here before the meeting. Even if a marshal moved fast, and they frequently didn't, it was too tight. We won't make it to Clearfield and back, she said. I know. So the meeting happens regardless. He looked at her steadily. The meeting happens regardless, he confirmed, which means the question is what kind of meeting it's going to be. She already knew. She'd known for several days, the way you know things you haven't yet admitted to yourself, carrying them around in the back of your mind until the moment comes when there's no more reason not to look directly at them. She was going to have to be there. She was going to have to stand up in that room, in front of Rourke and whatever men he brought and whatever version of Caleb showed up that day. And she was going to have to say out loud what she knew and what she suspected, with her ledger and her notes and Blackthorn's account of what he'd seen, and she was going to have to do it before Rourke could execute whatever document he'd prepared. It was not a solid plan. It had gaps in it she could put her fist through. But it was what she had, and she had made things from worse materials. I need you there, she said, not to fight. I need a witness. I need someone who can say out loud, in front of whoever Rourke brings, what you saw in that study. Blackthorn looked at her. You know what happens to my word in a room like that? I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. Where? He'll want to do it at the homestead. He's done it that way with others, goes to the property, which reinforces the idea that he's already in possession. She paused. Let him come. I'll be ready. She had 5 days. She spent them carefully. She went through the ledger until she could recite every entry from memory. She wrote out a clear summary of the pattern she'd identified. The 3 properties, the dates, the names of the phantom creditors, the timing of Rourke's acquisitions relative to the judgments. All of it organized on 3 sheets of paper in the most legible handwriting she'd ever produced. She made 2 copies, one of which she gave to Blackthorn, and one of which she rode into town and left with the freight depot operator with instructions not to open it unless she came back and asked for it, or unless she didn't come back at all, which she said with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel, and he received with a look that said he understood more than she'd said explicitly. On the 4th day, Caleb told her Rourke's meeting was confirmed for the coming Thursday at noon. He told her this over breakfast like it was an appointment about livestock and not about her life, and she nodded and said she understood, and his shoulders dropped about a 1/4 inch with relief, which told her he'd been expecting a fight and hadn't quite known what to do with the lack of one. She didn't fight with him. There was nothing left to gain from it. Whatever she felt about what Caleb had done, and it was considerable, a layered and unresolved thing that she didn't yet have the space to fully examine, she needed him manageable for the next 3 days. She needed him in that room on Thursday, and she needed him uncertain enough about what she was going to do that he didn't warn Rourke in advance. On Wednesday evening, Blackthorn met her at the Creek Road. He'd shaved, she noticed. She didn't mention it. Doyle will be with him, Blackthorn said, and probably 2 others. Rourke doesn't travel to close transactions without enough bodies to manage unexpected situations. Are you expecting it to get physical? He looked at her honestly. I'm not expecting it, he said. Rourke won't start it. He's too careful. But if you produce what you're planning to produce and it lands the way it should land, someone in that room will feel cornered, and cornered people don't always behave. She nodded. She had thought about this. I need it to be public enough that violence becomes a problem for him, if it's just the 4 or 5 of us in a room. You need witnesses outside the room, Blackthorn said. I need people who know what's happening and can see the shape of it. Not a crowd, just enough. She paused.
Clara Dodd would come if I asked her. Pete Dunnigan has been in this valley for 30 years, and he hated my father, but he respected him, and he's got no reason to love Rourke. That's two. Bert Cassell will show up to anything, she said. Something shifted in Blackthorn's face. Not a smile exactly. Closer to one than she'd seen from him. All right, he said. At noon, she said. If he arrives and there are people on the property, not confronting him, just present, just visible. It changes the calculation. It does, he agreed. He looked at her for a moment in the fading light, and she had the odd sensation of being seen clearly by someone, which was not always a comfortable thing, and wasn't quite comfortable now, but wasn't bad either. You're not afraid, he said. It was not quite a question. I'm afraid, she said. I'm just more afraid of the alternative. He nodded. That seemed to be enough for him.
She rode home in the last of the light with the valley spread out around her, the creek catching the last orange of the sky, the apple trees in the orchard standing dark against the ridge. 320 acres that had cost her father 23 years. The leaning barn, the house with the roof that needed work, the south fence she had reset herself. She put her horse in the barn and went inside. She sat at the table with the ledger open and went over it one more time, every name, every date, every amount, every gap where something should have been and wasn't. She knew it well enough now that she could hold it in her head entire. Tomorrow, noon. And whatever happened after that was going to happen to a woman who had chosen it, which was different from anything that had happened to her so far. Rourke arrived at 11:45. Tessa heard the horses before she saw them, 4 of them, which was one more than Blackthorn had predicted, and she registered that extra number with a quiet adjustment in her chest, the kind of recalculation you do when the situation confirms it's going to be harder than the optimistic version. She was standing on the porch when they came up the road, and she had made a deliberate decision about where to stand and how to stand there, which was not in the doorway where she might seem like she was defending a threshold, and not down in the yard where she'd have to look up at men on horseback, but on the top step, level with a mounted man's chest, close enough to be present and far enough back to be in possession of herself. Rourke rode in front. Doyle was just behind him and to the right. 2 other men she didn't recognize came after, and they had the particular quality of men who were there to be a fact rather than a conversation. Wide through the shoulders, watching the tree line, hands loose but positioned. Caleb came out of the house behind her. She'd told him nothing specific, only that she had something she needed to say before anything was signed, and he'd spent the last 2 days in a state of careful watchfulness that she recognized as his version of worry. He stood slightly behind her and to her left, which put her between him and Rourke, which she didn't think was accidental. Rourke pulled up and looked at the porch, then at the yard, and she saw his eyes move to the left where Pete Dunnigan was leaning against the fence post near the barn with his arms folded, and then to the right where Clara Dodd stood near the well with her hands in her apron pockets, and then to the road where Bert Cassell had positioned himself with the transparent pretense of having some business with the fence latch that he'd apparently been attending to for the last 40 minutes. Rourke's face registered all of this without changing, which was a kind of skill in itself. "Miss Holloway," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once been in a conversation he hadn't controlled. "I understood we had a meeting at noon." "You do," she said. "Come in." She turned and went inside without waiting to see whether he followed. She heard his boots on the steps, and Doyle's, and then Caleb's nervous shuffle, and she went to the kitchen table where the ledger was open and her 3 sheets of notes were laid out flat and took up her position standing, because she wasn't going to sit down for this. Rourke came in and looked at the table. He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He did not sit down either. "I want to address something before we proceed," she said. "Tessa," Caleb's voice from the doorway, warning. She didn't look at him. "I've been reviewing the land transaction records for Cimarron County going back 5 years, she said, and she kept her voice level because she'd practiced this, the way you practice anything you need to be able to do without thinking while your hands are shaking. "I found a pattern in the properties you've acquired, Mr. Rourke. 3 of them show liens and judgments filed against the original owners in the months before they sold or defaulted. The creditors named in those instruments don't appear in any other county record before or after those specific transactions." Rourke said nothing. His stillness was the kind that has mass to it. "One of those creditors is a man named Elias Pryor," she continued. The instrument bearing his name was used to take Garner's property on the South Creek 2 years ago. Elias Pryor has no tax records in this county, no hotel records, no land records, no record of any kind except that single promissory note. She paused. I believe that note is fraudulent. I believe the same is true of instruments filed against at least 2 other properties you now hold. The room was quiet. Outside, a horse shifted and blew. That's a serious accusation, Rourke said. His voice had not changed. That was the thing about him that was hardest to manage. He didn't react in the ways that would give her something to push against. He was still like deep water is still. I know it is, she said. I've been careful about making it. Careful, he repeated, and something moved behind his eyes, quick and cold. You've been reviewing county records. I have. On what basis? You're not a lawyer. You're not. I'm the owner of 320 acres of property in this county, she said, and a woman who learned how to read at 6 and has been keeping accounts for this homestead since I was 14. I understand what I found. Rourke turned his head slightly toward Doyle, which was not a signal she could read precisely, but was clearly something. Then he looked back at her. Miss Holloway, I understand you're in a difficult position. You've lost your father, your brother has had to make hard choices on behalf of your family, and it's natural to look for someone to blame for circumstances that are— I'm not looking for someone to blame, she said. I'm telling you what I found in the public record, and I'm telling you that there is a witness who has seen the original documents in your possession. Documents which, if examined, would confirm that the signatures on those instruments were made by the same hand. That landed. She watched it land, the way a stone drops into water. Not a visible splash, but a disturbance that moves outward. Rourke's face didn't change, but his stillness changed quality, became something tighter. What witness? He said. The door opened. Blackthorne came in. He came in the way he did most things. Without performance, without announcing himself, just present, and then suddenly fully present in a way that changed the dimensions of a room. He was wearing the same clothes he always wore, and he had the same expression he always had, which was the expression of a man who had assessed a situation and decided how much of himself it required. He looked at Rourke without particular heat or hostility, just looked. Doyle's hand moved to his side. Blackthorne didn't look at him. You, Rourke said. One word, but the temperature of it was different from everything he'd said before. I was in your study 9 days ago, Blackthorne said. He didn't elaborate on how, and Tessa noted the absence of that detail and was grateful for it. I saw a strongbox. I saw the instruments inside it, the Garner note, 2 others, and a letter from Judge Crane. Whatever you think you saw, I saw what I saw, Blackthorne said simply. And I can describe the contents of that letter in enough detail that a territorial marshal would have grounds to request the originals. The silence stretched. Caleb made a sound. Not a word. Something smaller, a kind of exhalation. Tessa risked a glance at him. He was standing in the doorway with his face doing something complicated and awful, the face of a man who is understanding, too late, the nature of what he got himself into. She looked back at Rourke. The letter of intent my brother signed, she said, is not a contract. It contains language that makes it contingent on a formal agreement, which requires my signature as a party to the marriage. I am not signing anything. She kept her voice even, though her hands had been gripping each other behind her back for the last 4 minutes, and her right thumb was going to have a bruise. And if you attempt to pursue any claim against this property on the basis of that letter, I will take everything I have found to the territorial marshal's office in Clearfield. I will take it to the county newspaper. I will take it to every property owner in this valley whose name appears anywhere in proximity to yours in the public record. Rourke looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Blackthorne. Then he looked at the table with the ledger and the 3 sheets of paper, and she watched him do the same calculation she'd been doing for weeks, the same arithmetic of exposure and consequence, and she watched him reach the end of it. Doyle, he said. Doyle moved, not toward Tessa, toward Blackthorne, which was the threat that made sense from Rourke's perspective, the one that could be managed physically, the one that wasn't a woman with a ledger and a room full of witnesses. He was fast. Blackthorne was faster, or at least had been expecting it for longer, and he caught Doyle's arm before it completed whatever it had been doing, and they went sideways into the wall with a crash that shook the lamp on its hook. Caleb shouted something. Tessa grabbed the ledger and her papers off the table and stepped back, and did not get out of the way. She was not going to retreat from her own kitchen, but positioned herself against the wall near the window where she could see the room entire. It was not a long fight. Blackthorne was not in the business of prolonged conflict, and Doyle, whatever his other qualities, discovered in the next 30 seconds that he was outmatched in a way that additional effort wasn't going to fix. When it was over, Doyle was on the floor with his hand pressed against his jaw, and Blackthorne was standing over him, breathing hard, with a cut above his left eye that was dripping blood onto his collar. He looked at the two men still in the doorway. They looked at Rourke. Rourke said, "Leave him." It took Tessa a moment to understand he meant Doyle, that they were to leave Doyle on the floor and go. The two men stepped back from the doorway. Outside, she heard them move toward the horses. Rourke picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. He looked at Tessa. His face was its usual contained, itemizing face, but something behind it had shifted. Not broken, not afraid, just reconfigured, the way a calculation looks when a variable changes. "You're making an enemy," he said. "You made yourself one," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he walked out. Doyle got himself up off the floor without assistance, which Tessa thought took some doing, and followed. She heard them go down the steps, heard the horses, heard them leave. The kitchen was quiet. It smelled like lamp oil and the coffee she'd made that morning and something metallic from Blackthorne's cut. Pete Dunnigan appeared in the doorway, looked at the room, looked at Blackthorne, looked at Tessa. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Pete looked at Doyle's departed absence on the floor. "Good," he said, and went back outside. Caleb hadn't moved from the doorway. He was looking at the table where the papers had been, even though the papers weren't there anymore, like he was looking at something that had already happened that he couldn't go back to. His face was the face of a man who has been standing in water he thought was shallow and has just understood it's over his head. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly, because she was tired and it was not a day she wanted to spend on anger. He sat. Wow. What followed was not simple or fast, because nothing real ever is. Tessa rode to Clearfield 6 days later with her ledger and her 3 pages of notes, and Blackthorne's written account of what he had seen in Rourke's study, which he had written out in full the night after the confrontation in a handwriting that was plain and careful and nothing like what she'd expected. She went with Pete Dunnigan, who had decided without much discussion that he was going with her, and who rode the whole day and a half in his usual silence, punctuated by the occasional piece of information she hadn't asked for and found useful anyway. The territorial marshal's office was in a building that needed paint and had 3 men in it, one of whom was actually a marshal. His name was Vickers, and he was 50 years old and had the manner of a man who had heard a great many stories and learned to hold his opinions until he'd heard the whole thing. He listened to everything. He read what she had. He asked questions, good ones, specific ones, the kind of questions that meant he was thinking rather than managing. When she got to the part about the letter from Judge Crane, he wrote something down. "The originals are in Rourke's possession," she said. "We can describe their location within the house. We can identify witnesses who've seen them." Vickers said. He looked at Blackthorne's written account for a while. "How long does this take?" she asked. He looked up at her over the paper. "Longer than you want it to," he said. She had been prepared for that. "The properties Rourke has already acquired. Can't give those back without a court process," he said. "If the instruments are fraudulent, the acquisitions can be challenged. That takes time, and it takes the original owners being willing to participate." He paused. "Some of them may not want to go through it." "Some of them will," she said, thinking of Garner, of the way Blackthorne had said his name. Decent man. Vickers nodded slowly. "I'll need to contact the county attorney, and I'll need a judge who isn't Crane." He said the name without inflection, but she caught what was behind it. "That last part is the trickiest piece." "But you'll do it," she said. He looked at her. "Miss Holloway," he said. "I've been waiting for something solid to come in on Rourke for 2 years. What you brought me isn't everything, but it's the most solid thing I've seen." He put the papers down. "Yes, I'll do it." She rode back feeling something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, because relief implied the thing was over, and it wasn't. Not triumph, because that felt wrong for a thing that had cost this much and wasn't done. Something more like ground under her feet. the feeling of standing on something real. Rourke's people came back one more time 3 days later, and not to the homestead. They came to town, Sutz, Doyle and one of the two men from the meeting, and they went to the freight depot and they had a conversation with Bert Cassell that was clearly meant to be the kind of conversation that caused people to reconsider what they knew. Bert Cassell, to his credit, had in his possession the sealed envelope Tessa had left with the freight depot operator the week before, the one with the instructions about not opening it unless she came back and asked for it, or unless she didn't come back at all. When Doyle finished his conversation, Bert came directly to Tessa's property and told her about it. She sent word to Vickers. Vickers arrived in Harlow Creek 4 days later with another marshal and a county attorney from the next district over, a thin young man who looked exhausted and turned out to be better at his job than his appearance suggested. They went first to the county clerk's office. They went next, with a warrant, to Rourke's property. She wasn't there for it. She was at the homestead mending the fence on the south side near the creek, because the fence still needed mending regardless of what else was happening, and because she had found, over the past weeks, that work was the thing that kept her from going sideways in her own head. She heard about it later from Pete, who had apparently followed the marshals at a discreet distance out of what he described as general curiosity and what was obviously something else. They found the strongbox. They found the instruments inside it. They found the letter from Judge Crane. Doyle, when presented with the choice between providing information and facing charges as a participant, chose to provide information, which took most of the morning. What came out of it was worse than Tessa had suspected, and exactly as bad as the pattern in her ledger had implied. The fraudulent instruments went back not 3 properties, but 5. Elias Pryor, it turned out, had a counterpart named Walt Greer, who had appeared in 2 other transactions with the same impossibility of prior existence. Both names traced back through Doyle's accounting to a man in Kansas City who produced legal-looking documents for a fee and had done business with Rourke for 7 years. Judge Crane resigned before the matter reached a formal hearing, which surprised no one and settled nothing, but it was a fact. Caleb left the valley in September. He didn't leave badly. There was no scene, no final confrontation. He came to Tessa a week after Vickers' visit and told her he was thinking about heading west, California maybe, or Oregon, somewhere he could start without the shape of what he'd done already drawn in the air around him. He said it plainly, without much dressing around it, which was the most honest thing she could remember him saying in months. She sat with it for a while before answering. "Take the horse," she said finally, "and the $40 in the tin on the shelf. That's what I can give you." He looked at her. He seemed to expect more, either from her or from himself, and she thought maybe he was waiting for her to tell him it was all right, that she forgave him, that things between them were repaired, and she couldn't give him that. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the clean, simple way he wanted it. What she felt about Caleb was complicated and would stay complicated, and she was old enough to know that not everything that gets broken gets fixed. "I'm sorry, Tessa," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "Go." He went. She stood on the porch and watched him ride down the road, and did not watch him until he was out of sight, because that wasn't the kind of woman she was. She went back inside. She had accounts to finish. The apple harvest came in mid-October, earlier than usual, which Pete Dunnigan said meant a hard winter. And Pete Dunnigan was right about weather, the way some people are right about things they've had no choice but to learn. Tessa picked for 3 days straight with help from Clara Dodd and Clara's teenage son, who was 14 and worked with the focused, slightly resentful efficiency of someone who would rather be anywhere else but understood he was needed. They filled 18 bushels. It was the best yield the orchard had produced in 4 years, which her father would have attributed to the wet spring, and which Tessa attributed to the fact that she'd finally pruned the east row the way she'd been wanting to for 2 seasons, and nobody had been around to tell her she was doing it wrong. Blackthorn helped carry the bushels to the root cellar. He didn't make a thing of it. He just showed up on the second morning with his horse and a willingness to work, and nobody commented on it, and by the end of the day, Clara's son had stopped being resentful and started asking him questions about horses that Blackthorn answered with more patience than Tessa would have expected from him, more patience than she had herself on a long day, which told her something about him she filed away without examining too closely. That evening, after Clara and her son had gone, Tessa sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee gone cold and looked at the valley in the last light. Blackthorn was in the barn checking on the horses. She could hear him moving around in there, the particular sounds of a person who is comfortable with animals and doesn't feel the need to narrate what they're doing. It was a quiet sound. She had grown accustomed to it over the past weeks without quite deciding to. He came out eventually and sat on the step below her, which put him slightly downhill, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that becomes possible with people once you've been through something real with them. The valley held its light late in October, the sky going green before it went dark, and the creek was audible from here if you weren't talking over it. "Vickers sent a letter," she said. "I know. You told me." "Did I?" "Yesterday. You said it came Thursday." She had told him. She'd been telling him things without registering that she was doing it, which was its own kind of information. "The county attorney is moving forward on the Garner claim," she said, "and 2 others. Vickers thinks if those go through, the remaining properties are straightforward." She paused. "It'll take a year. Maybe more." "Probably more," Blackthorne said. "Legal things always did." "Garner might get his land back," she said. She'd been sitting with that thought for 2 days. What it meant. What it cost him that it might come back now instead of 2 years ago. There was no clean way to feel about it. Justice that arrives late is still justice, and also isn't, both things at once. And the people who'd been harmed in the gap between the wrong and the reckoning carried something that land and money didn't fully address. She knew that. She thought Blackthorne knew it too. "You should write to him," Blackthorne said. "I was going to. I can give you an address. He's with his daughter outside Taos." She looked at the side of his face. He was looking at the valley. "You've been in contact with him," she said. "Off and on." She thought about that, about Blackthorne maintaining that connection over 2 years, riding into the valley to chase a pattern he couldn't yet prove, carrying Garner's story around with him the way people carry things they can't put down. She thought about what it cost a man with his reputation to be taken seriously, in a marshal's office, in a county attorney's hearing, in a room full of people who'd heard his name used as a warning. He had offered it anyway. She thought that was worth more than he seemed to understand about himself. "Thank you," she said. "For the record, I don't think I said that properly before." He glanced at her. "You said it." "Not properly." He was quiet for a moment. "You did the work," he said. "I just confirmed what you'd already figured out." "You went into that house," she said, "at night, alone, with Rourke's men somewhere on the property." "I've done riskier things for worse reasons," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood. She looked at the valley. The green had gone out of the sky. "Are you planning to stay?" she asked. She kept her voice even, the way she kept her voice even when she was asking something that mattered more than she wanted it to show. He was quiet for a beat. "I haven't had a reason to stay anywhere in a while," he said. "I'm finding I have one here." Another beat. "If that's all right." "It's all right," she said. They sat there while the dark came in, and neither of them said anything else about it, and that was enough. Submit. The thing about rebuilding is that it doesn't look the way people imagine it when they're still on the far side of needing to do it. People think of rebuilding as a particular kind of effort, decisive, visible, heroic in some modest way. What it actually is Tuesday. It's the 17th Tuesday in a row where you get up and fix what broke yesterday, and figure out what's going to break tomorrow, and make decisions about things you don't have enough information to decide with certainty, because the information won't exist until you've already made the decision. Tessa knew that. She'd known it since she was 12 years old, following her father across the South Ridge, learning that the land didn't care about your intentions, and the weather didn't negotiate, and the difference between a farm that made it and one that didn't was almost never a single dramatic moment. It was accumulation, 10,000 small decisions, most of them unglamorous, a lot of them wrong, corrected before they became disasters. It was showing up on Tuesday. She showed up on Tuesday. She fixed the barn roof, which she'd been putting off since spring, enlisting Blackthorne and Pete Dunnigan and Clara's son, whose name was Marcus, and who turned out, once you got past the resentment, to have a genuine aptitude for carpentry that nobody had thought to mention to him yet. The 4 of them spent 4 days on that roof, and it came out uneven in places and solid throughout, which was the best you could say for most things. She made the mortgage payment in full in November, which required a conversation with Hargrove at the bank that she'd been planning since July. She laid out the accounts, cleared and current, walked him through where the property stood and where she intended to take it, and asked for a formal restructuring of the remaining note, on terms she'd calculated to be fair to both sides. Hargrove looked at the accounts for a while. Then he looked at her, and she had the impression he was revising some long-held assumption about her, and she waited without filling the silence, because she'd learned that filling silence in a room like that was almost always a mistake. "Miss Holloway," he said finally, "your father was a man I respected, despite the fact that he was never easy to work with." He paused. "I expect you'll be easier." "I won't be," she said pleasantly. Something shifted in his expression that was almost a smile. "No," he said. "Probably not." He signed the restructuring agreement. Word about what had happened with Rourke moved through the valley in the way that significant things move through small communities, imperfectly, with distortions and embellishments, some details inflated and others lost, but with the essential shape of it intact. People understood that there had been a scheme, that it had been stopped, that the woman on the Holloway homestead had been the one to stop it. They understood it imperfectly, which is to say they understood it the way people understand most things they didn't directly experience, which is well enough for most practical purposes. What shifted in the valley after that was subtler than what she'd expected. She'd expected, if she was being honest with herself, some version of acknowledgement, the kind of small social correction that happens when a community realizes it misjudged someone. What she got instead was something harder to name. People started bringing her things, questions, problems, disputes about fences and water rights, and the fair price of freight, and whether young Marcus Dodge should be apprenticed to the carpenter in town, or whether his mother needed him at home. They brought her these things not because she had any official standing, and not because she had asked for them, but because she had shown, in a way that couldn't be argued with, that she was the kind of person who thought problems through and didn't flinch from the conclusions. She was careful about it. She'd seen how that kind of thing could turn, how a person who becomes the repository of other people's troubles can disappear into the role, lose the thread of their own life inside the accumulated weight of everyone else's. She wasn't interested in that. She had her land, her orchard, the accounts she kept with the stub pencil in the brown ledger. She had things she was building, and she wasn't going to let the building get swallowed by the managing. But she helped where she could, practically and without ceremony, because the valley was where she lived and the people in it were the people she'd grow old among, and because there was something her father had understood without ever saying it directly, that you held your land not just by working it, but by being part of the web of obligations and trust that a community runs on. He hadn't been good at the personal parts of that. She was better. Not naturally. She'd had to learn it the way she'd learned everything useful, by paying attention and being wrong about it a few times first. In February, a letter came from Caleb. It was postmarked from Oregon, a town she didn't know. The letter was 2 pages, which was more than Caleb had written to anyone in his life as far as she knew, and the handwriting was his familiar cramped scrawl but slower than usual, like he'd been deliberate about it. He was working on a fishing dock, he said. He'd found work with a freight company. He was fine. He didn't describe it as fine. He said he was doing all right, which for Caleb was more honest than fine. He didn't explain himself, didn't try to make her understand what he'd been thinking, or construct a narrative around what he'd done that made it more forgivable in the telling. He just said he was sorry for what he'd done, and that she deserved better than what he'd been able to give her when it mattered, and that he hoped the land was holding. She read it twice. Then she put it in the back of the ledger, behind her notes, because she didn't have a better place for it yet. She wrote back. It took her 3 drafts, because the first 2 kept becoming arguments she didn't actually want to have on paper, and the third found its way to something more like the truth, which was complicated. She told him the land was holding. She told him about the roof and the orchard and Marcus Dodd's discovery that he could build things. She told him the mortgage was current. She told him she didn't know yet what things between them were going to be when they were something again, but that she didn't think they were nothing. She sent it without the drafts. Spring came back the way it always did, indifferent to what had happened the year before. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the grass came up in the bottomland before the frost was fully out of the ground, and the apple trees in the orchard put out blossoms 2 weeks early in the same way they had the year before the best harvest her father ever had. She didn't take it as a sign because she wasn't a person who trusted signs. She took it as weather. Blackthorn rebuilt the fence along the south property line that spring, the whole run of it, because Tessa had reset individual posts 3 times now, and the real problem was the posts themselves, which were the originals her father had put in and were 20 years into a 10-year life. He did it over 3 weeks, cutting and setting, and she worked alongside him for the parts she could manage and handed him things for the parts she couldn't. And they talked while they worked the way you talk when your hands are occupied and there's no particular pressure on the conversation. About the valley, about the properties whose cases were working through the county system, about Marcus Dodd, who had started an apprenticeship with the carpenter in town and had been incandescent about it in the way young people get about discovering something they're actually made for. "What happened to your reputation?" she asked one afternoon, somewhere in the middle of the second week of fencing. He looked at her over a post. "What about it?" "It was supposed to be the most dangerous man in the territory," she said. "Something like that. I heard it at least 3 times when you first arrived." "You heard that?" "Bert Cassell said it. Pete Dunnigan confirmed it." He went back to the post. "Pete Dunnigan thinks everything with 4 legs is dangerous," he said. "He's spent too long with sheep." "You're not answering the question." He was quiet for a moment. "I was," he said finally. "Not in the way people meant it, probably. I was in places that required a particular set of abilities, and I was better at it than most, and that generates a kind of reputation that isn't entirely accurate and isn't entirely wrong." He paused. "I don't miss those places." "Do you miss anything about it?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. The fact that he actually thought about it, instead of reaching for whatever answer sounded right. "The clarity," he said finally. "Things were very clear in those situations. The problem was obvious, and the solution was physical, and you either got it right or you didn't. The rest of life is messier." "It is," she agreed. "I've decided I prefer it," he said, and went back to the fence. She looked at the valley, the creek glinting in the morning light, the apple trees coming into blossom on the far side of the orchard, the ridgeline holding its old familiar shape against a sky that had that particular February blue that looks colder than it is. 320 acres. The leaning barn, which no longer leaned after last fall's repairs. The new fence line going in post by post. There's a thing people talk about when they talk about the frontier, a mythology of it. The lone individual carving civilization out of wilderness, the self-made person standing against the landscape by force of will and individual virtue. It makes a compelling story, and it is not accurate. What she knew, from living it, was that nothing on the frontier survived alone. Every homestead that held on, because of a web of small debts and reciprocities and mutual obligations that nobody talked about much because it wasn't the kind of thing that made for a good story. Her father had survived 23 years on this land, not because he was exceptional in isolation, but because of Pete Dunnigan's help during the drought, and a neighbor's fence post borrowed in the bad winter, and debts repaid in labor and goods, and the small continuous human work of being part of a place. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully understood at 22, when she'd been running on conviction and a brown ledger, and the grim certainty that she was right. She'd been right. But being right hadn't been enough by itself. She'd needed Blackthorne in that study, and Clara Dodd at the freight depot, and Pete Dunnigan writing to Clearfield without being asked, and Bert Cassell holding the envelope she'd left him, and the county attorney who turned out to be better than he looked. She'd needed all of them. The victory, if you wanted to call it that, and she wasn't sure she did, it felt too much like the beginning of things rather than the end, hadn't been hers alone. She thought about what her father would make of that. Amos Holloway, who had driven the borrowed horse into this valley 23 years ago with his pregnant wife, and his stubbornness and his absolute conviction that a man held what he built by his own effort and nothing else. She thought he would have argued with her. She thought he would have been wrong, and that somewhere in the part of him that had actually survived out here, he would have known it. She had a postcard of the valley he'd kept for 30 years, drawn by some traveler passing through when this part of the territory was newer than it was now. He'd kept it tacked to the wall above his desk without ever explaining why. After he died, she'd taken it down and looked at it for a long time. This simple piece of cardboard with a rough sketch of hills and creek and the suggestion of a settlement just beginning to exist, and she'd understood that for him it had been something like a promise. The place he intended to stay, the thing he was building toward. She had taken the postcard and put it back on the wall. She didn't need the same things from it that he had. She didn't need a promise, because the promise had already been kept or broken or complicated into something more real than a promise, which is to say it had become her actual life. But she kept it because it was his, and because it was the valley, and because there was something in the act of a person choosing to stay somewhere and mark it as the place they belong that she understood now in her bones in a way she hadn't when she was younger. She had chosen this. All of it. Not the circumstances. Nobody chooses those. But the response to them. The standing up and saying no, and doing the patient, unglamorous work of building something that lasts. That was not something that had been done to her or given to her. She had done it herself, with help, imperfectly, over the course of a year that had cost her more than she'd known she had to spend. The fence was going to take another week. The orchard needed attention before the blossoms set. There were accounts to run and a letter to write to the county attorney about the Garner claim and spring planting to plan for ground that would be ready in another 3 weeks if the weather held. Tuesday was coming, the way it always did. She picked up the next post and carried it to where Blackthorn was waiting, and they got back to work. There is a thing people talk about when they talk about the frontier, a mythology of it. The lone individual carving civilization out of wilderness, the self-made person standing against the landscape by force of will and individual virtue. It makes a compelling story, and it is not accurate. What she knew, from living it, was that nothing on the frontier survived alone. Every homestead that held on because of a web of small debts and reciprocities and mutual obligations that nobody talked about much because it wasn't the kind of thing that made for a good story. Her father had survived 23 years on this land, not because he was exceptional in isolation, but because of Pete Dunnigan's help during the drought and a neighbor's fence post borrowed in the bad winter and debts repaid in labor and goods, and the small, continuous human work of being part of a place. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully understood at 22, when she'd been running on conviction and a brown ledger and the grim certainty that she was right. She'd been right. But being right hadn't been enough by itself. She'd needed Blackthorn in that study, and Clara Dodd at the freight depot, and Pete Dunnigan writing to Clearfield without being asked, and Bert Cassell holding the envelope she'd left him, and the county attorney who turned out to be better than he looked. She'd needed all of them. The victory, if you wanted to call it that, and she wasn't sure she did. It felt too much like the beginning of things rather than the end. Hadn't been hers alone. She thought about what her father would make of that. Amos Holloway, who had driven the borrowed horse into this valley 23 years ago, with his pregnant wife, and his stubbornness, and his absolute conviction that a man held what he built by his own effort and nothing else. She thought he would have argued with her. She thought he would have been wrong, and that somewhere in the part of him that had actually survived out here, he would have known it. She had a postcard of the valley he'd kept for 30 years, drawn by some traveler passing through when this part of the territory was newer than it was now. He'd kept it tacked to the wall above his desk without ever explaining why. After he died, she'd taken it down and looked at it for a long time. This simple piece of cardboard with a rough sketch of hills and creek and the suggestion of a settlement just beginning to exist, and she'd understood that for him it had been something like a promise, the place he intended to stay, the thing he was building toward. She had taken the postcard and put it back on the wall. She didn't need the same things from it that he had. She didn't need a promise, because the promise had already been kept or broken or complicated into something more real than a promise, which is to say, it had become her actual life. But she kept it because it was his, and because it was the valley, and because there was something in the act of a person choosing to stay somewhere and mark it as the place they belong that she understood now in her bones, in a way she hadn't when she was younger. She had chosen this, all of it. Not the circumstances, nobody chooses those, but the response to them, the standing up and saying no and doing the patient, unglamorous work of building something that lasts. That was not something that had been done to her or given to her. She had done it herself, with help, imperfectly, over the course of a year that had cost her more than she'd known she had to spend. The fence was going to take another week. The orchard needed attention before the blossoms set. There were accounts to run and a letter to write to the county attorney about the Garner claim and spring planting to plan for ground that would be ready in another 3 weeks if the weather held. Tuesday was coming, the way it always did. She picked up the next post and carried it to where Blackthorn was waiting, and they got back to work.